This is Darwin to Jesus. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to tackle a common accusation that atheists often make against Christians, the so-called God of the Gaps fallacy. In case you haven't heard of this, I'll explain what it is. Then I'll explain why atheists are often misusing this phrase. Before I begin, I want to say that if I see any good responses to this video by an atheist, I will respond to the best one. Stick to the arguments, be clear, and make good points, and you will be the winner. Now let's get into it. The expression God of the Gaps is normally said by atheists when a theist points to something that science has not yet explained, and the atheist is accusing the theist of making the argument, science can't explain this, therefore God. Now obviously, if the atheists were correct in their interpretation of what's happening, then they'd be right and this would be a fallacy. But they're not right about what's happening. So here's what's actually happening. Imagine two detectives arrive at a scene where a body has been found. They are faced with two potential theories to explain what happened. The first detective believes that the best explanation for the evidence is that a murder took place. Someone else was involved in the death. The second detective, however, thinks that the person died of natural causes, meaning no other person was involved. As they examine the evidence, both detectives try to fit the facts with their respective theories. The detective who believes in the murder theory might point to bloody footprints leading away from the scene and say to the other detective, if your theory is correct and no one else was involved in this death, how do you explain these bloody footprints? The detective isn't necessarily claiming that the footprints prove there was a murder, but he is challenging the natural cause theory to account for this evidence. This scenario is analogous to discussions between theists and atheists. In these debates, we are dealing with two overarching theories. Either God exists, theism, implying that a mind is responsible for the existence of everything, or God does not exist, atheism, suggesting that everything can be explained by natural causes without a mind, naturalism. When theists observe certain facts that seem difficult to explain on naturalism, they ask atheists, how do you explain this on your theory? For example, theists might point to the origin of life and ask, how do you explain life arising from non-life? On naturalism, it's challenging to understand how life could emerge from non-life, as this seems counterintuitive. However, on theism, it's much easier to explain because an intelligent designer, God, could have created life. This question is not a God of the Gaps argument, where God is invoked simply because something is unexplained. Instead, it's a comparison of which theory, naturalism or theism, better accounts for the available evidence. Just like the detectives comparing their theories, the best explanation is the one that can account for the most facts in the simplest and most coherent way. Theists argue that their worldview provides a more straightforward and comprehensive explanation for certain phenomena, such as the origin of life, than atheism does. When a theist asks, what is your explanation for this phenomena, whether it be consciousness, the beginning of life, or the beginning of the universe, and the atheist has no answer because science has not solved the problem, the atheist might respond by saying, well, you're just assuming that God must be responsible. In doing so, the atheist is really admitting that they don't have any explanation within their worldview for these phenomena. This situation would be like a detective who believes a murder took place, pointing to bloody footprints leaving the scene and asking his partner, how do you explain these bloody footprints if the cause of death was natural? How do you explain these if there was no other person involved? If the other detective then dismisses this by saying, this is just murder of the gaps, without actually addressing the question, it's clear how disingenuous and lacking in substance that response would be. The question by the first detective is legitimate and deserves an answer, but instead the response shifts to a straw man argument about what the first detective is saying. Similarly, when atheists resort to the God of the Gaps accusation, they're tacitly admitting that their worldview is unable to account for certain phenomena and facts that we observe. Instead of acknowledging this, they misrepresent the theist position by asserting that we're saying, you don't know, therefore God. But that's not what actually is being said. It's not, you don't know, therefore God must exist. Rather, it's, you can't explain this on your theory, so my theory should be the one that we consider, because your theory fails to account for this, and my theory has no problem accounting for this. So this is actually just an inference to the best explanation type argument. Another thing that I want to address is the misconception that if something is explained scientifically, then that necessarily entails naturalism, and that we should think if something has a scientific explanation, we don't need to ask any further questions. This is simply not the case. To illustrate, imagine two very smart ants studying a car engine. They could crawl around the engine, examine how it works, and even figure out the purposes of each part scientifically. They might learn that if certain components move, the pistons fire, and they could eventually understand the entire operation of the engine. But no matter how much they study it scientifically, they'd never be able to answer why the engine exists, or why the engine is put together in the way that it is. The question of why there is a working engine is entirely different from the question of how does this engine work. In this scenario, the engine was obviously designed, but a scientific ant focused solely on how things work might never come to that conclusion. This analogy shows that science, while incredibly powerful for understanding mechanisms and processes, is not equipped to answer deeper questions about purpose, meaning, or origins. Notice I'm not saying that purpose, meaning, or design exist, but what I am saying is that if they exist, science couldn't tell us. Just like the ants wouldn't discover the engine's creator through scientific inquiry alone, we can't fully understand the why of the universe or life itself by only asking how questions. What's really ironic about all this is that atheists are often guilty of committing naturalism of the gaps. When atheists accuse theists of committing God of the gaps, they argue that theists are inappropriately filling in gaps in scientific knowledge with a divine explanation. However, this critique overlooks the fact that atheists themselves often engage in naturalism of the gaps. They assume that any gap in our current understanding will eventually be filled by a naturalistic explanation, even though they have no evidence for this at present. This is essentially the same kind of leap that they are criticizing the theists for making. Alright, I think that about does it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to support the channel. I really appreciate that. And I hope you found this video helpful. Have a wonderful day, and God bless.